Hello and welcome to this video where we'll be discussing narrative research. Narrative research is interested in exploring how different people experience the world around them. This involves interpreting participants' narratives accounts. Narrative research can be defined as collecting and analysing the accounts people tell to describe experiences and offer interpretation. Lieblich et al. Goes a bit further with their definition. They suggest that what narrative researchers hold in common is the study of stories or narratives or descriptions of a series of events. These researchers usually embrace the assumption that the story is one, if not the fundamental unit that accounts for human experience. But what counts as stories, the kinds of stories they choose to study, or the methods they use for study vary. Within the frameworks of narrative research, researchers use a number of research approaches, strategies, and methods. So what can we take from these definitions to try and understand narrative research? Well, first of all, narrative research is the study of how different people experience the world around them. Narrative research requires participants to provide a narrative account which detail experiences and perceptions pertaining to various aspects of life. Narrative researchers then use these accounts to collaboratively construct a narrative about the experiences and meanings that participants contribute to these experiences. As we saw in the second definition, narrative research allows some flexibility in terms of the approach and methods used to extract these narratives used within the research. Although, of course, as the research is focused on narratives, the data is likely to be qualitative to allow the participant to express and explain their narrative. Characteristics of narrative research include a focus on the experiences of individuals, a concern with the chronology of individuals' experiences, a focus on the construction of life stories based on the data collected, storying or the telling of a story as a technique for constructing a narrative account, inclusion of context and place in the story to truly understand what is going on and what happened in the account. A collaborative approach that involves the researcher and the participant in the negotiation of the final text. Creswell suggests that there are some key considerations when it comes to narrative research. These include considering who authored or developed the account or story, and who provided the story. Now, of course, there can be second-hand stories, so we need to be able to determine who authored the story and then who provided it, and was it the same person. We also need to work out the scope of the narrative and story. So how far do we want to go back, or what do we want that narrative or story to include? And whether the topics being researched can be included in one narrative, or do we need several narratives from different angles, or potentially different stories and narratives from the same individual? So key considerations include: who do we need to talk to get the required information, and how many stories or narratives do we need, and from who and how many people? The most common data collection methods for narrative business research include narrative interviews, where we interview people to try and develop a narrative from the research participant, or potentially personal narratives, where we get our participant to detail their own narratives, potentially through reflection or other methods. But narrative research can also include data collected through other methods, such as life writing, life histories, or autobiographies. I'm going to say a few words about narrative interviews, as these are probably the most common data collection method for narrative business research. Whilst on the surface narrative interviews are similar to traditional research interviews, they might have unique features designed to unearth participants' narratives and stories. These features might include drawing and discussing timelines, chronologically charting events, discussing pictures and memories, storytelling and providing examples, or using similar prompts. Now, depending on the depth required for the research project, several interviews might be required, particularly if the research is looking to cover a narrative over a long time frame. When it comes to linking research philosophies and research designs, there is always a degree of interpretation and justification, and no hard and fast rules. However, I personally would argue that narrative research would be at the more social science end of the philosophical spectrum, so could potentially align with interpretivism or phenomenology, depending on the focus and goal of the research, and whether the researcher is seeking to cross-compare accounts or focus on individual experiences. So to conclude, narrative research is focused on understanding, interpreting, and analysing participants' narratives. Narrative research allows some scope to select the most appropriate method of collecting participant stories and narratives. Whilst narrative interviews are common in business narrative research, these should be designed carefully to ensure the required depth and narrative are elicited from the interview with participants. I would argue that narrative research fits more comfortably on the social science end of the philosophical spectrum, given its interest in people's experience and the communication of this experience through qualitative data to create a narrative